Hello everyone, welcome to the 19th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the 8th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. In this week, we are discussing dependency theory, and if you slightly recall, the way we started with dependency theory, especially in the context of Latin America, dependency theory in fact emerged in the context of the Latin American debates on underdevelopment. Okay, if you see this, as we have already discussed, dependency theory refers to a set of theories which maintained that the failure of third world states to achieve adequate and sustainable levels of development that resulted from their dependence on the advanced capitalist world. Dependency theories developed in opposition to the optimistic claims of modernization theory, which saw the less developed countries being able to catch up with the West. In other words, the proponents of dependency theory stressed that Western societies had an interest in maintaining their advantaged position in relation to the less developed countries and had the financial and technical and colonial imperialist wherewithal to do so. A variety of different accounts of the relationship between the advanced and less developed states evolved within the broader framework of dependency theory, ranging from the stagnationism and surplus drain theory of Andre Gunder Frank to the more cautious pessimism of those who envisaged a measure of growth based on associated dependent relations with the West. Then we have discussed in the last class, the major contribution to dependency theory was undoubtedly that of Andre Gunder Frank, a German economist of development who devised and popularized the phrase the development of underdevelopment. Okay, this is extremely important in the context of dependency theory. It describes what Frank saw as the deformed and dependent economies of the peripheral states, in his terminology, satellites of the more advanced metropolises. In Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America in 1969, Frank argued that the third world was doomed to stagnation because the surplus that it produced was appropriated by the advanced capitalist countries through agencies such as transnational corporations. Frank himself insisted that growth could only be achieved by serving ties with capitalism and pursuing autocentric socialist development strategies. As a prefatory remark, as we have discussed, the dependency theory was flawed by an overemphasis on economic factors and in some versions a necessitarian logic based on the idea of a surplus drain, extraction and appropriation of profits from the less developed economies to the rich and powerful nations. Nonetheless, it had the merit of drawing attention to the international dimension of development and brought the power relations between states under scrutiny. The emergence of the newly industrializing countries as a group of successful led developers challenged the validity of the core assumptions of dependency theory, demonstrating that successful led industrialization was possible under certain circumstances and suggesting the need for a more sophisticated and disaggregated approach to third world development. Okay. Then we have discussed how the dependency approach originated in the extensive Latin American debate on the problems of underdevelopment. Dependency approach not only contained an effective criticism of the modernization paradigm, which postulates that the less developed economies would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism, but also provided an alternative perspective and still functions as a catalyst in the development theory which is taking shape at present. The dependency school emerged from the convergence of two intellectual traits. On the one hand, neo-Marxism, and on the other hand, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, popularly known as ECLA tradition. The concept of neo-Marxism reflects a certain dualism in Marxist thinking, that is, on the one hand, the traditional approach focusing on the concept of development and taking a basically Eurocentric view, and on the other hand, a more recent approach focusing on the concept of underdevelopment and expressing a third world view. I mean, the kind of dualism that it posed, I mean, neo-Marxist thought posed, I mean, controversies persist as to the continuity or discontinuity of these two approaches. One approach holds its analysis from the vantage point of the developed countries, and the other holds its views from the vantage point of the less developed countries. Okay? A second important background to the dependency school was the more indigenous Latin American discussion on underdevelopment, reflecting specific economic and intellectual experiences in various Latin American countries, particularly during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The economic crisis dramatized the version of Latin American dependence, and it initiated more systematic economic research, and it necessitated a policy of import substitution, later systematized into a development strategy. Then we have discussed Marxism versus neo-Marxism from four vantage points: Marx and the Third World, Marxism in Latin America, the New Left in Latin America, and Paul Baran and the rise of neo-Marxism. Especially Paul Baran's concept of economic surplus, Paul Baran's concept of the distinction between actual surplus on the one hand and potential surplus on the other. Okay. Then we have discussed differences between Marxism and neo-Marxism from four vantage points. These include imperialism and nationalism 1, classes 2, revolution and ethics 3, and ecology 4. Okay. From the vantage point of imperialism and nationalism, we have discussed Marxism as interpreted by Lenin sees imperialism in a center's perspective, that is, as a stage of development of capitalism that is alternatively known as monopoly capitalism. And in Lenin's terms, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. On the contrary, neo-Marxism sees imperialism from the peripheries or the victim's point of view, from the point of view of the less developed countries. For example, Mao Zedong's nationalistic appearance and so on. I mean, in other words, the interest has shifted from development to underdevelopment. So, far classes are concerned, the Marxist analysis of classes is based on specifically European experiences, while that of the neo-Marxists is based on the revolutionary struggle in the Third World with a much more generous view of different groups' revolutionary potential. It is, I mean, if putting it succinctly, whereas Marxists have difficulties seeing anyone but the industrial proletariat, industrial workers, as the revolutionary class par preference, the neo-Marxists tend to let the peasantry play this role, claiming that the industrial workers of the Third World in reality form a labor aristocracy. Marxists believe in the existence or eventual emergence of a national bourgeois in the Third World, whereas neo-Marxists see the bourgeois as the creation and tool of imperialism, and as such incapable of fulfilling its role as the liberator of the forces of production. Then we have discussed from the vantage point of revolution and ethics, the neo-Marxists view the possibilities of starting a revolution with greater optimism, even if the conditions may be unfavorable. Look at the example of cultural revolution in the People's Republic of China, guerrilla warfare in Cuba, and so on. On the contrary, Marxism emphasizes organization and peasant party work, particularly amongst the industrial workers. Neo-Marxists emphasize the role of subjective factors, moral stimuli, the new individual, the new man, and so on. Whereas Marxists retain materialism and the emphasis on objective conditions and so on. From the vantage point of ecology, we have discussed how Marxism still shows the traces of the 19th century development optimism, 19th century evolutionism, 19th century view about industrialization as a marker of progress, as a marker of development, and so on. On the contrary, some neo-Marxists now try to integrate the growing ecological consciousness and the demands of environmental movements with their theory of development, sustainable development, and the blind faith in industrialism has been challenged. Neo-Marxists argue that, you see, we must use our natural resources so that we must keep something for our future generations. We must sustainably develop. Okay? Why? No, precisely because our resources are scarce, our resources are limited. We cannot afford to use all our resources at one go. We must keep them for our future generations so that they can also use. I mean, whenever we develop, we must sustainably use, we must sustainably develop. Okay? Because our natural resources are scarce, our natural resources are limited. On the contrary, Marxism suggests that what is scarcity? Scarcity is a bourgeois invention to legitimize economic inequality. Okay? We have discussed till this point. Now, in this lecture, we are going to discuss Ekla development thinking in terms of Raoul Prebisch and Ekla, programmed industrialization, the Ekla theory of development, and so on. When you look at Ekla development thinking, as a prefatory remark, during the interwar period, a growing number of ideas and analyses based on concrete Latin American conditions as well as more systematic social science research began to appear. Until then, social sciences, when I say interwar period, I mean the period between the First World War and the Second World War. Okay? Until then, okay, I mean prior to the interwar period, prior to the period between the First World War and the Second World War, until then, social sciences had mainly consisted of speculations in social philosophy, strongly influenced by European culture and social debates. The Latin American authors were isolated thinkers, who mechanically grafted European 18th century evolutionism, Comte's positivism, and social Darwinism on Latin American conditions. The indigenous analysis of Latin America, which appeared at the end of the 19th century, were orgies in self-criticism and catalogues of Latin American weaknesses. For example, if you look at Chile, if you look at Bong's Nuestra America and Chilean Francisco Encina's Nuestra Inferioridad America. I mean, if you look at these on our Chile's economic inferiority, its causes and consequences that he wrote, Encina. The obvious conclusion from this type of analysis was the idea of economic development through imitation. Then if you want to make development possible, you just copy the West, you just imitate the West, you just ape the Western models of capitalism. Okay, that was the thought process, and that was challenged in the context of Ekla development thinking. In 1895, I mean prior to the interwar period, the Argentinian Alberti said North America is South America's great economic example. That's what people also used to say, that if you look at Great Britain as well as India, then Great Britain is India's great economic example, because they colonized us for almost 2 centuries. As a result of this, you will find that for a long time, even now, we want to ape the West, we want to mimic, we want to copy the West. But our features are different. India is culturally, economically, politically, socially different from most of the countries of Europe. If our contexts are different, then our development policies must also be different. We cannot keep on copying the West, we cannot keep on copying other countries of Western capitalism to make development possible in our own country. As a result of the First World War, the Mexican and Russian revolutions and repeated interventions by the US Latin American states, repeated interventions by the United States of America in South American states or Latin American states' internal affairs, there was a change towards finding the faults in the surrounding world rather than in Latin America. At the same time, the social analysis began to be based on more systematically conducted research rather than on their own internal factors and their more or less subjective ideas influenced by European social research and debates. As far as the social sciences were concerned, Chile appeared to be the country providing the most favorable conditions for research, particularly in the area of economics. Systematic instruction in the subject was given as early as 1813. The economic journal, Revista Economica, was founded in 1886. The Department of Economics at the Catholic University was formed in 1922 and that of the Chile University in 1935. Led by President Cerda, the Popular Front government founded the Corporación de Fomento de Producción in 1939, and this agency constituted the link between academic research and practical social planning. They tried to initiate a number of empirical studies which later formed the basis for a macroeconomic analysis which broke a number of economic taboos because of its orientation towards domestic economic problems. Chile developed inter alia a positive attitude towards central economic planning, and such view was further expanded when the United Nations located the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLA, in Santiago, in Chile. It is interesting to note that the debate on economic research resulted in a certain polarization between the economists of the ECLA and the National University on the one hand and those from the Catholic University on the other. The Catholic University was influenced by the Chicago School and were known as the Los Chicago Boys. On a more theoretical level, this conflict manifested itself in the famous debate between structuralists and monetarist viewpoints. Coming to the way ECLA tradition, ECLA development thinking emerged, grew and so on, you will find that the Great Depression of the 1930s was a great divide in economic theory in the industrialized world, and it is also in these experiences that we find the roots of a specifically peripheral theory of economic development. The key figure here is undoubtedly Raul Prebisch, who from 1935 to 1943 was Director General of Banco Central in Argentina, a country that was most severely hit by the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. The idea of a center periphery structure in the world economy was implicit in Prebisch's early economic policy writings concerning Argentina, in which inward directed development and industrialization were seen as the remedy. It should nevertheless be noted that this industrialization drive is a recurrent phenomenon which can be structurally explained as the ideology of latecomers in development. Such ideology goes back to Friedrich List and the German reaction to Britain as the workshop of the world, and subsequently emerging in other industrializing countries. The United States in the mid 19th century, Russia in the late 19th century, Eastern and Southeastern Europe in the interwar period, and Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Mexico in the 1930s and 1940s. It was the experiences of these countries which provided the rationale for the import substitution strategy recommended by ECLA in the 1950s. The formulation of a consistently distinctly Latin American view of underdevelopment and development is intimately related to ECLA tradition, founded in 1948 in Santiago in Chile. In addition to 21 Latin American countries, Great Britain, France and the Netherlands also became members. As opposed to most of the other regional UN agencies, the Economic Commissions for Asia and Africa, the ECLA soon developed its own views on the problems of underdevelopment and development. The one who really should be credited with this achievement is Raul Prebisch, who became head of the ECLA in 1950. Prebisch wrote a document eventually to become the ECLA Manifest, the economic development of Latin America and its principal problems, that he wrote in 1950. This document suggests that in Latin America, reality is undermining the outdated schema of the International Division of Labor, which achieved great importance in the 19th century and as a theoretical concept continued to exert considerable influence until very recently. Under that schema, the specific task that fell to Latin America as part of the periphery of the world economic system was that of producing food and raw materials for the great industrial centers. There was no place within it for the industrialization of the new countries. It is nevertheless being forced upon them by events, 2 world wars in a single generation, in 1914 to 1819 and then 1939 to 1945, in a span of 3 decades. You will find we found 2 world wars. Okay, there is no place within it for the industrialization of the new countries. It is nevertheless being forced upon by events, 2 world wars in a single generation, in a span of 3 decades, 2-3 decades, and a great economic crisis. The Great Depression of the 1930s. They have shown the Latin American countries their opportunities, clearly pointing out the way to industrial activity. It is obvious from this that Prebisch sought the causes for Latin America, Latin American underdevelopment outside the continent, and he found them in the system of international free trade. Consequently, his first attack was on the neoclassical theory of trade. According to Prebisch, this theory, the neoclassical theory of trade, you will find through the works of Raul Prebisch, supported the existing international division of labor, in which the periphery had specialized in the production of primary goods, primary products, and the center in the production of industrial goods, as well as the idea that this division of labor would result in the greatest possible advantage to all the parties involved. As an example, Prebisch demonstrated that according to the neoclassical theory of trade, what would happen if technical progress was more rapid in the center's production of industrial goods than in the periphery's production of primary products. Assuming that the fall in prices would be inversely proportional to the growth of productivity, the prices of industrial goods would fall more rapidly than those of raw materials. The periphery would then be able to purchase more industrial goods for the same amount of primary products, and thus progress would accrue to all countries of the world even without an industrialization of the periphery. Raoul Prebisch's own empirical studies nevertheless showed that this prediction was not generally valid. This prediction by the neoclassical theory of trade. Prebisch found that Great Britain's terms of trade had gradually improved since 1880, and since Great Britain was predominantly an importer of primary products from the colonized world, he concluded that during this long period the terms of trade of the primary producing countries, that is the periphery including India, had seriously deteriorated in relation to Great Britain, that is the center. Raoul Prebisch's explanation of the deterioration of the periphery's terms of trade was that most of the profits from various increases in productivity had benefited only the industrialized countries. Prebisch also tried to demonstrate that this had not been a unique phenomenon, but a sign of underlying structural relations which the neoclassical theory of trade had not taken into account. On the production side, the theory had primarily neglected the neoclassical theory of trade had primarily neglected the true market structures. Technical progress may favor the producer by reducing costs, which in turn may increase profits and or wages. Prebisch claimed that development in the center rarely led to price reductions, mainly because of the high degree of monopolization of the factor and goods market there. The fact that imperfect competition was dominating meant that price falls could be avoided, and also that the labor unions, because of their strength, could claim a share in the technical progress in the form of increased wages. In the periphery, the opposite was supposed to be the case. Here the consumers received the fruits of technological change via reduced prices, mainly because primary producers operate under competitive conditions. However, in reality, it was the consumer in the center who was favored, since technical progress in the periphery primarily occurred in the export industry. In this way, the center would benefit from the periphery's technical progress as well as from its own. On the demand side, it was noted that the goods produced for export in the center and in the periphery had different income elasticities. The income elasticity of imported primary products in the center was considerably lower than the income elasticity of imported industrial goods in the periphery. This was a result inter alia of Engels' law, which states that the percentage share spent on food is a diminishing function of income. An increase in income in the center would therefore lead to a lower percentage change in the demand for imported primary products than a similar increase in income in the periphery would change the demand for imported industrial goods. Thus, even the demand side held elements that would lead to a deterioration of the primary producing countries' terms of trade. Through this analysis, Raoul Prebisch came to the conclusion that the underdevelopment of Latin America was due to its reliance on exports of primary products, also known as the Prebisch Singer thesis, Milton Singer and so on, Hans Singer. Prebisch also claimed that a continued emphasis on the export of primary products would inevitably lead to a further deterioration of the periphery's terms of trade. In turn, this would affect the domestic accumulation of capital, and you will find that the international mechanisms of equalization would function as predicted by the neoclassical theory of trade if the periphery were to export industrial goods instead. Thus, Latin America would be able to keep the fruits of its own technical progress. The natural solution to the problem was therefore industrialization. Okay. For example, W. L. Lewis came to similar conclusions through his analysis of the Caribbean, the West Indies. However, his development strategy was rather the opposite to that which emerged in Latin America. Lewis proposed an export-oriented industrialization, whereas Prebisch's and the Ekla strategy roughly may be summarized like this. The process of industrialization, was to be speeded up by the substitution of a large part of current imports by domestic production. Initially, domestic industries were to be protected from foreign competition by tariffs and other support measures, but once their competitive ability had improved, the firms should be able to manage on their own. The production of raw materials would continue to play an important role in the Latin American economies. The income earned from exporting raw materials should be used to pay for imported capital goods and thus help increase the rate of economic growth. Initially, foreign businesses were held to speed up the process of capital accumulation. However, there was a certain feeling of reservation towards greater dependence on foreign subsidiaries. Governments should actively participate as coordinators of the industrialization program. Increased government involvement to break the chains of underdevelopment. It was necessary for the government involvement to break the chains of underdevelopment, and later towards the end of the 1950s, the ECLA became the driving force behind the efforts at creating a Latin American common market in order to facilitate further industrialization. Then what kind of that what is the nature of that industrialization? What kind of industrialization then? No, that is called programmed industrialization. If the ECLA's theoretical explanation and underdevelopment and its sketches of alternative development strategies are called the first stage. The first stage refers to strategies. The second stage may be said to have begun when the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLA, tried to translate the strategies into practical policies. The initial guidelines for this work were drawn up at a conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1953. A well-prepared policy of industrialization was said to be required if the process of underdevelopment was to be reversed, and the ECLA therefore tried to convince the Latin American governments of the necessity of this, offering to assist in the preparation of detailed development programs for each country. The phrase programmed industrialization became popular. Initially, ECLA strategy was rather coldly received by the Latin American governments, which is also why most of the Commission's development programs remained paper exercises. This resistance to its ideas explains why the ECLA could not and should not propose measures that were too radical of affected internal problems. Land reforms and other basic structural changes never received a high priority on the list of necessary changes. A couple of years later, I mean in towards the end of the 1950s, several Latin American governments did in fact begin to collaborate more closely with Latin America. Who are those? With ECLA, with the Commission, with the Economic Commission of Latin America. I mean, who are those countries? I mean, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and so on. They were among the first countries to follow ECLA strategy. The Commission could now directly influence the development strategies by offering technical assistance in their planning and application. But what was even more important, it could influence the development process indirectly by training local planners in the ECLA way of thinking. Okay? The Commission's doctrines were therefore quickly spread across the continent. The belief that industrialization was the remedy to underdevelopment spread not only to the Latin American countries during the 1950s, but to most of the countries in the third world. It was generally assumed that the repeatable and the current traditions in these countries were the ultimate goal of development. A well-developed industrial sector was considered to be typical of a modern society. The various characteristics of an underdeveloped society would automatically disappear in the process of industrialization. The traditional oligarchy, for example, would play a diminishing role, which should eventually lead to both economic and political democracy. That is why I said decline of traditional oligarchy leads to both economic and political democracy. What is that? I mean, this in turn was thought to be necessary for the development of a modern mass consumption with a high level of technology, culture and scientific activity. Because of their belief in progress, because of their belief in the alternative to capitalist theory of development, because of their belief in the alternative to modernization paradigm, because of their belief in progress, these Latin American scholars were given the nickname developmentia. Okay? I mean, the proponents of dependency theory, the proponents of development theory and so alternative development theory. The Brazilian Celso Furtado was one of them, having experienced the rapid expansion in Brazil during the 1950s. Furtado wrote, by now the Brazilian economy could count on its own dynamic element. Industrial investments supported by the central market growth quickly became two-dimensional. Each new impulse forward would mean an increasing diversification, a larger mass of resources for investment, a quicker expansion of the internal market and the possibility of such impulses being permanently surpassed. When you come to the ECLA theory of development, okay, especially Raul Prebisch's analysis of terms of trade is usually the only one referred to in this context, but it is important to realize that ECLA and Prebisch had more to say. In spite of the fact that most of the interest was focused on an analysis of the external sector, they actually tried to present a complete theory of development which particularly emphasized the structural imbalances between center and periphery. Their approach not only dealt with questions related to the theory of trade and the strategy of industrialization, but also encompassed the entire complex of development. ECLA attempted to demonstrate that underdevelopment is not the same as undevelopment. If you look at underdevelopment and undevelopment, they are not same. right? Okay. When I say undevelopment, okay, it implies lack of development. Okay. That is why Ekla attempted to show that underdevelopment is not the same as undevelopment. Okay. Undevelopment means lack of development, and underdevelopment was instead to be thought of as the result of a specific process that has led to underdevelopment in one part of the world and development in another. Ekla nevertheless did manage to formulate a general theory of development. Instead, a new method of analyzing the complex of underdevelopment was used, that is the structuralist method. Okay. But in spite of that, the paradigm of modernization was never really abandoned. Apart from its rather unconventional treatment of international relations, the commission was quite traditional. The greater optimism of Ekla economists about the ability of industrialization to put an end to underdevelopment must be critically examined. Like many other economists at the time, the Ekla theorists overemphasized the role of capital in the development process. After all, the main point was that the periphery's deteriorating terms of trade affected the accumulation of capital and consequently also the rate of economic growth. Thus, the paradigm of modernization was still pretty alive, but the Ekla and its new approach formed the basis for its eventual abolition. Their structural approach, I mean that early structuralism, which is a part of this structuralist method, is extremely important not only in the theoretical debate on development, but also a number of other theoretical contexts such as the Latin American inflation controversy. The cause of inflation had been keenly discussed in Latin America since the early 1950s. This debate is not as well known outside Latin America as that about the development of the terms of trade. The Ekla rarely participated officially, but some of the economists working at the commission did. At an early point, they attempted to formulate a theory of inflation which was to be an alternative to the prevailing neoclassical one, and particularly to the theory formulated by the monetarists, of whom the most extreme claimed that inflation was not a result of a given economic system, but rather a problem of the printing press. Inflation was primarily due to the irresponsibility of individual finance ministers who printed too much money to cover the government's budget deficit. The solution to the problem was therefore simply to stop the printing presses, which essentially is the same thing as reducing government expenditures. Actually, in mainstream as well as alternative economics circles, what is the difference between inflation and robbery? Okay. At one point of time, you may find that robbery is illegal, robbery is very exploitative in nature. At the same time, inflation is also very exploitative in nature. And both these forms of exploitation, okay, but robbery is illegal, whereas inflation is that kind of exploitation which has been legalized. Okay, because of the nature of the state, because of the nature of the state within the matrix of a class divided society, because of the nature of the state and its relationship with various other contending social forces and so on. The structuralists, on the other hand, claimed that the Latin American countries faced several structural problems which automatically created inflationary pressures. Basically, they were attributable to supply inelasticities. In other words, in economies with such problems, limitations of the quantity of money would not stop inflations, except in the very long run at the cost of, for example, a rise in unemployment to unacceptable levels. The monetarist solution to the problem, which was simply a proper monetary policy, was therefore rejected. With reference to the ECLA analysis of the general process of growth in Latin America, which primarily sought development as a result of the supply of capital, the structuralists criticized the organizations that followed the monetarists' recommendations for having far too restrictive criteria for lending money. I mean, who are those organizations? I mean, namely the International Monetary Fund, popularly known as the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, popularly known as the World Bank. And the political recommendations made by ECLA had a common denominator, the demand for increased government involvement. When I say increased government involvement, I mean it was the task of the government, it is the task of the government to correct all structural elements standing in the way of development. Nevertheless, ECLA always pointed out very carefully that it did not propose a planned economy. The Russian model was so vigorously rejected as the laissez-faire model. I mean, ECLA, the proponents of ECLA tradition, they not only brought about a critique of the modernization paradigm, they also had rejected the Soviet model of development planning. Okay. At the same time, they had already rejected the laissez-faire model. Laissez-faire means laissez-faire. It implies non-interference or non-intervention of the state, of the government. The market economy was to remain, but under the surveillance of the government. The government should not withdraw from its basic responsibilities. Okay? This Keynesian view played an important role in Latin America. What John Maynard Keynes suggested as a solution to the Great Depression of the 1930s, that a single dose of investment can create a generation of income and employment as well. When he said a single dose of investment, he referred to public investment, public spending. Okay? If there is no if there is no public investment, if there is no public spending, if there is no government spending, then you cannot create income and employment. Employment cannot be created in vacuum, right? Employment must be created through public spending. That is the basis of Keynesian economics, which he outlined in the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money of 1936. Okay? That's why when ECLA tried to point out very carefully that it did not propose a planned economy, and that's how both the Soviet model as well as the laissez-faire model were rejected. The market economy was to remain, but under the surveillance of the government. This Keynesian view played an important role in Latin America, but it was also accepted in almost all of the third world. Since the 1950s, governments have played a much more active role in these economies than in any other part of the capitalist world. An extensive debate followed in the wake of the ECLA tradition. Attacks were launched from both liberal as well as radical corners. The debate between the liberal economists and the ECLA is of little interest to the growth of the dependency school, and is therefore not, I mean it's of more relevance, however, is the criticism of the modernization paradigm coming from Latin American social scientists. Okay. Then what we have discussed today? We have discussed ECLA development thinking in terms of Raul Prebisch, who was the Director General of Banco Central in Argentina, and his contributions to the development and growth of the ECLA tradition, I mean the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, in terms of programmed industrialization, and the ECLA theory of development. Within ECLA development thinking, we have discussed influence of how during the prior to the interwar period there was an influence of European 18th century evolutionism, Comte's positivism, emanating from theological stage to metaphysical stage to scientific or positivistic stage, and social Darwinism on Latin American conditions. And these European 18th century evolutionism, Comte's positivism, social Darwinism on Latin American conditions were challenged in the interwar period, I mean the period between the First World War and the Second World War. That's how indigenous narratives were sketched in Latin America. The Mexican, the Russian revolutions and repeated interventions by the United States of America in Latin American states' internal affairs were witnessed. We have discussed today Raul Prebisch's role in the formation of ECLA, the economic development of Latin America and its principal problems, and how Prebisch systematically attacked the neoclassical theory of trade. He tried to discuss center-periphery structure in the world economy in the context of the fallout of the Great Depression of the 1930s. He looked at inward directed development and industrialization as remedies to underdevelopment, import substitution strategy recommended by ECLA in the 1950s, formulation of a distinctly Latin American view of underdevelopment and of development. Then we have discussed process of industrialization, import substitution, production of raw materials, greater dependence on foreign subsidiaries, government involvement to break the chains of underdevelopment. ECLA being the driving force behind the efforts at creating Latin American common market in order to facilitate further industrialization. And what kind of industrialization? That is programmed industrialization. The first phase depicts strategies, the second phase depicts or rather translates those strategies into practical policies. And industrialization policy was required to reverse the process of underdevelopment through programmed industrialization. We have discussed how local planners in the ECLA way of thinking, decline of traditional oligarchy that has led to both economic and political democracy, modern mass consumption with a high level of technology, culture and scientific activity. Then we have discussed the ECLA theory of development, Prebisch's analysis of terms of trade, external sector, structural imbalances between center and periphery. There is a difference between undevelopment and underdevelopment. Undevelopment means lack of development. Underdevelopment means the result, it is the result of a specific process that has led to underdevelopment in one part of the world and development in another. This is, and then structuralist method, peripheries deteriorating terms of trade effect, the accumulation of capital and consequently also the rate of economic growth, structural problems with automatically created inflationary pressures, increased government's involvement. And in the next class what we are going to do, we are going to discuss the Latin American critique of the modernization paradigm, Stavenhagen's 7 erroneous theses on Latin America of 1966. Then we will discuss Cardoso, Stavenhagen's, when I say Stavenhagen's 7 erroneous theses on Latin America, Stavenhagen was dealing with Mexico and Cardoso also Mexico. Then we will discuss Dos Santos in the context of Brazil and Sunkel, Oswaldo Sunkel in the context of Chile, and then we will discuss Andre Gunder Frank, the main architect of the dependency theory. When he wrote Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America in 1969. But at the same time, the way Frank wrote wrote an influential paper, The Sociology of Development and Underdevelopment of Sociology. Okay, we will discuss these portions starting from within the Latin American critique of the modernization paradigm. Within that we will discuss Stavenhagen, Cardoso, Dos Santos, Sunkel and then Frank, and then we'll move to how the Ekle analysis has been radicalized further in the lectures to follow. Thank you.